Well, welcome everyone. We're very pleased to organize this educational event and program, and really to have it as a conversation with Tosan, just really wanting to learn from a leader. And so we have a series of questions that we're going to talk about. There's some things that Tosan really wants to share with the group, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's program. So my job is just to keep us on track and keep the time going and just lead us through this conversation. So Tosan, why don't you describe your career path and how you ended up as Chief Operating Officer at Sacramento San Francisco General Hospital, and what do you think has driven your career advancement?
Can everyone hear us back there? First off, I want to say thank you to everyone coming here. It is so cold outside, so I'm glad that you were able to still brave through the winter chill out there. And hopefully you found parking. If you didn't find parking, I'm sorry, but there's tons of parking out there. And then the other thing I'll say is we are in the command center, so we are in the level 1 trauma center. Anytime any major issue happens in San Francisco, this is the room where everyone floods to, so in case the world is ending outside, we will have to vacate this room. But hopefully there's no earthquake or planes crashing or anything like that. So the question was, how did I get to where I am? I'll say the very, very first thing is mentors. I'm very, very, very privileged and grateful to have had mentors, people that actively invested in me and looked out for me. I'll say after graduate school, I was in a situation where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, actively figure out where I'm going to invest my time. And I was working in a psychiatric hospital, and there was a moment where my boss at the time went on medical leave, and I ended up covering for her. And it really, really gave me the opportunity to figure out, okay, so what do I want to spend my time doing? How can I figure out what is going to really, really motivate me to wake up every morning? And in that moment, when I was covering for her, I genuinely appreciated what I was learning, what it's like to work in a psychiatric facility. And after that, I realized what my passion was. And I was in this world of, after college, I was working in a graveyard shift. And my job at that time was really what we would call like a sitter or a coach. And it was actively, watching suicidal patients. And my job was literally to make sure, and I'm looking at some people in the room who are very familiar with this, really make sure that people who were a danger to themselves and society, my role was to be there for them and make sure that they were okay, make sure that they were safe. And that really helped me find out what my path was, or at least helped me figure out how to find out what my path was. And then after that, while I was in grad school, another opportunity opened up, and I was working in another psychiatric hospital where my role was really in training and development. So every time an issue happened in the hospital, my job was to figure out with leadership and learning from the staff, how do we make sure this does not happen again? And at this point in time, I was working in psychiatric hospitals. And it was a really, really great way for me to learn how is everything I'm learning in grad school applied to hospitals, and how is everything I'm learning in hospitals applied to grad school. And, being an immigrant, I don't know if, we have any Nigerians in the house or Indians or whatever, so there's this thing of like, when you're in America, the idea of one job is like, one job, you got to work more than one job, right? If you can. So I was working at the graveyard shift in one hospital, then I'll go to another psychiatric facility and work the swing shift at that point in time, just to like gain as much experience for me. And I'll never forget, I was overwhelmed. And I was struggling at a lot of points, but it really forced me to learn. And then one day, I'll say a couple of years later, I was really presented with this opportunity to either move to California to get a fellowship. A lot of people here might be familiar with fellowships, and fellowships are very, very super duper competitive. I've seen people nod their heads. So, thousands of people apply for this across the country, and if you happen to get it, it's a life-changing moment, right? They spend 2 years investing resources into you to be a leader. And I had this opportunity to move to California as a fellow, or I had this offer in New York. So this is all going on in Jersey. This offer in New York to become a practice administrator while I was applying for a fellowship, and I chose to move to California. And I sold everything I had, moved to California. went through my fellowship, and in the middle of my fellowship, 6 months into it, they were like, "Hey, Tosan, for one of your projects, we want you to write a job description for how to run a clinic. There's this one clinic we've been having a lot of problems with. We want you to really come up with a leader. What are the characteristics? What are the traits? Talk to us about a business plan." I was like, "Hey, I'll do it for free." And I volunteered to do it, to learn. My job was literally to learn to be a leader. And then they were like, "Are you sure?" I was like, "Yeah." And then they integrated that to my fellowship. And 6 months into my fellowship, they promoted me to be interim. And while I was interim, I was privileged to be running the liver transplant clinic at the time. And I recall we had clinics in San Diego and in Riverside County, Marietta, Corona as well. And then while I was doing this, we're like, "Hey, we want you to help us figure out how we can, replicate this for kidney transplant." I was like, "Hey, I'll do it," and that opportunity opened up, and somehow, and this is why I think about mentors again. A leader in a hospital in the Bay Area had heard about the work I was doing, and one day I got a call, and then I ended up selling everything in San Diego, moving to the Bay Area, and then it's really just been one of those things where, a lesson I would share with the group is when an opportunity presents itself, you find yourself trying to figure out, what is the decision to make. And for me, I've always thought about what is the steepest learning curve. The steepest learning curve, just with my personality, I find the most rewarding. And then another theme that I'll share is pick the boss. There's a difference between the job and the boss. The boss is the person that is, that is the person you're going to go to at your, if the relationship is right, your most vulnerable moments, when you want help, when you have questions. And those two themes have really, really helped me to get to where I am today. And I'm also a very, 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 very big believer in standing on shoulders. As much as I'm here, I did not do it by myself. Mentors have been very, very critical for me. Choosing the gigs with the steepest learning curve, and actively just really, really, really thinking about who is the boss and choosing that over whatever comes with the job.
Wow, there's a lot of themes that we could pick up from Pat. Thank you so much. So one of the things you mentioned that about your initial career was in New Jersey, and then you came to California.
Yeah.
2 coasts. And I'd be interested to know, do you have any observations you want to share about cultural differences between the East Coast and the West Coast?
Has anyone lived in the East Coast before? 5 people? I would say one big difference is the East Coast is a lot more formal than the West Coast. West Coast is super laid back. East Coast is formal. One of the things I've come to actually appreciate that laid back feeling. And in the West Coast, there's and I'm sure people who live in the East Coast might push back, but in the West Coast, there is a very, very blatant sense of activism that I've come to appreciate. Of activism, like when you're an advocate for something you really believe in, people in the West Coast, I'll speak specifically of the Bay Area, not San Diego too much, but in the Bay Area, people really feel like if this is something I believe in, I can bring it with me wherever I go. And that's something I've really come to appreciate in the West Coast. Yeah.
So advocacy is interesting. So what were some of the other experiences that may have shaped these career decisions that you made along the way? I mean, you talked a little bit about having mentors and taking risks in different kinds of work experiences, but are there other experiences that contributed to your decision-making process?
So, has anyone seen Hamilton? Yeah. Hamilton? Raise your hand, Hamilton. So there's a scene in Hamilton where they're like, immigrants get things done. You remember that scene? Okay, so I'm an immigrant. I genuinely believe that there is nowhere else on earth I could be where I am right now. I am quite literally a product of the uniquely quintessential American dream. With all the imperfections, that we struggle with, there is nowhere else this could have happened. And the reason I bring being an immigrant up is in how I was raised, just thinking about, I know what it's like to live without running water, right? So for me, no matter how bad my day is, like I remember what it's like to not expect electricity every day. And I say that, when I think about my parents, specifically my mother, and coming to the U.S., it was very, very important. She drilled it into my head of never forget where you come from, never forget why we came here, and the opportunities available to you. And just really, when I think about a lot of times, like the sacrifices that my family made for me to be here, and it's a really, really big driver for me. And it's also one of the reasons I've been, especially in I'll say for the past 10 years, dedicated to the safety of the population. That is who we serve. I am the population we serve. And I never want to forget that. That's why I've spent a lot of time in Jersey working for a safety net psychiatric hospital, working for UC in San Diego, working for Highland, working for San Mateo. I'm a product of that population, and it's really, really important to me to continue to support that work and really make it. When I think about my first experience with healthcare in the U.S., when I moved to the U.S. when I was 13, and I remember breaking my arm, getting like sideswiped by the car, and I was living in Florida at the time. And the thing with immigrants, like I never forget, like the way my family chose what hospital they were going to go to. Someone knew someone that knew someone that said, "Oh, this is the place you should go to, to get care." And I'll never forget, and thinking about this hospital, it was a place where immigrants felt like we can go here and feel safe. We can go here and people will listen. We can go here and there's someone that works here that will make you feel that, hey, I got you. And that is one of the quintessential reasons of why I choose to be in safety net healthcare, the immigration experience.
Thank you. So reading your bio, I discovered that you had traveled and visited 7 continents around the world. So what was the surprising thing you learned about the places you visited, and how did you manage the language and cultural differences?
Oh, wow, okay. Any travelers in the room? Okay. So I'll try to not take it too. Travel is like my religion. I love travel. So let's see if I can go through a couple of continents. So South America, my favorite place in South America was Bolivia. It was just a truly, truly magical place. You see the pictures of the salt flats, and then there's just parts of nature that you just didn't know were possible. It does not fit with your reality. Antarctica was like going to a different planet. It is the driest and simultaneously coldest place and brightest place on the planet. And learning how to be out there, to exist in a temperature that's not designed for us was incredible. If anyone goes to Oceania, check out New Zealand. It was like a painting. And then I'll say Southern Africa. As much as I was born and raised in Nigeria, I'd never been outside of West Africa. Like Southern Africa was my first non-West African experience in Africa, and it was a great experience, but it was also a reminder about colonialism. You talk about differences, like it's disturbing and fascinating at the same time how in the continent of, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, there's a correlation between how long colonialism went on for and how strong the infrastructure is. It's almost like the longer Europeans settled in the area, the more electricity we have, the better roads we have. The earlier, the locals fought against colonialism, the more corruption you have. It was just really, really, really fascinating. For me, when I think about healthcare and the types of patients we see, hospitals have always had this obligation of taking care of the community. And then we see people from all walks of life. So for me, being a traveler, it was an opportunity to really see the people we take care of, what are they like, where they are. And then I think about, in healthcare, a lot of times, our East Asian population, I'll speak specifically for DSMG, our East Asian populations are more often than not the least happy with their patient experience. But it also says something about like how available do we have interpreter services how culturally competent are the people who work here to take care of them. And travel for me has really, really emphasized that. We're all similar, and it's really about understanding how do we get to see each other, how do we meet each other where they are, so we can better be there for them. And travel, I can't recommend it enough. You talk about empathy and building empathy. Going to a place where you're the other will really, really help you build empathy. In Asia, I'm in so many family photos that I have no idea who they are. Just not seeing someone that looks like me in China, people just stop me and just take pictures with me. It was a strange experience. I remember backpacking in Shanghai. Someone was like, "Tosan, like, don't you get offended when strangers want to take pictures of you?" I was like, "No, if you're in Brooklyn and you see a unicorn come out the sidewalk, you run up to take a picture with a unicorn. The unicorn. I mean, it's just, yeah, it was just an interesting experience." Yeah.
So you've taken those personal experiences combined with your work experiences and just kind of shaped a lot of how you view healthcare.
Yes. View people.
And how you serve them
yes.
as a healthcare manager and a healthcare executive.
Yes, because ultimately people are at the center of everything we do in healthcare, and it's very easy to forget that, and it's a reminder for me why that should always be the foundation of everything we do.
Right. So, as you know, February is Black History Month, and there's a quote that I think might be appropriate as we go into this next section here. It's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., and it was spoken at the 1966 convention of the Medical Committee for Human Rights in Chicago, and he says, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman." So we know that health equity has been a major driver in your career. So maybe we would like to hear more about what does health equity mean for you, and take us into that conversation.
Okay. And so I'll start with coming into this role that I'm in right now. I'll say there are two reasons why I was very, very excited to come into this job. The first was, at some point last year, and I promise I'm not trying to get political, that there was a moment where things in the U.S. changed dramatically. It happened in the fall of 2016. For me, I felt a very, very strong, compelling reason to come to, in my opinion, one of the leading safety net systems in the country. And coming here, I wanted to be on the front lines of how healthcare was going to be impacted. Like, one of the reasons I became so passionate about healthcare was the Affordable Care Act. And at a certain point in 2016, when things went the way they did, I had this profound feeling about how do we protect. I mean, the ACA, a lot of people forget, is called the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. It's not just the ACA. We were originally called the PPACA, but then people got tired of 2 syllables before that. It's the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And for me, I really, really wanted to figure out how can I get in the front lines of protecting the vulnerable that people were less likely to think of. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to work in San Francisco General. And the idea of health equity is something that a lot of people struggle with, and I've been trying to figure out why is that the case. And if a lot of people believe that as equality and equity are the same thing. So I would like to just show this group something.
This is a great graphic.
So what do people notice? What's the difference between these two graphics? Hopefully you guys are awake now that you have to participate.
It's okay, it's a conversation. Remember.
Okay, the steps are the same height on one side.
And the ground is uneven.
The ground is uneven.
And the right side, they can see, all of them can see the feet.
Oh, one person's vision is...
On the left side, one person's vision is blocked.
Yeah.
Right? On the right side, everyone can see. What else?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
The steps are uneven.
Yes, the steps are uneven. Well, the steps aren't uneven. It's the same box, but the ground is uneven.
On the left side, but on the right side, they need that extra boost.
Any other comments? So, I mean, this has become a passion of mine, and just really trying to emphasize there's a difference between equality and equity. A lot of times people are under the impression that the right thing to do is to do the same thing for every patient. Is that the right thing to do? You know, the questions that every single person asks their provider is not the same. So when we say everyone should get the same care, that does not necessarily mean that everyone is going to get the same outcome. So with equity, the idea is people with the least resources sometimes require more, not equal effort to get the same opportunities. So equity is really in the boxes, because not everyone starts out at the same place. As a person that was born and raised in Nigeria, I have a higher predisposition to hypertension, just straight. Being born in sub-Saharan Africa. If you know anyone from sub-Saharan Africa, the way they react to the TB test is going to be very different if they were born there, right? So if you're born in sub-Saharan Africa, when you take your TB test, no matter what happens, it's going to come out positive. That is where you start, right? Why? Because you were exposed when you were younger, so the way your body reacts and your immunity is very different, right? If you're born in sub-Saharan Africa, you can't give blood. Why? Because of there's a whole bunch of different reasons. But the idea of equity is, how do we make sure that when someone comes to receive care, we meet them where they are? If someone shows up to a facility and they're like, hey, listen, if someone doesn't know that where they live, if they don't know they're going to be able to have housing tomorrow, how can we expect them to follow their instructions? Right? If you have a child that lives in a home with 4 smokers and they show up for asthma medication, the place that they're going back home to is going to be very different. So equity and equality are vastly different. So my hope is at some point in the future, we as people in healthcare can start thinking about, where are we in these boxes? How do we do right by our diverse population? How do we meet our patients where they are?
So you talked a little bit about reducing disparities in healthcare, and talk more about how that has shaped your vision of management, healthcare management. Taking these experiences, taking your thoughts about equity, and how does that figure into your management perspectives?
So I wear 5 hats in my current job. There is my first hat is about capital planning. That is all the construction and facility design projects happening on campus. My second hat is about facilities. That's how we keep the lights on. My third hat is about support services. That's everything from EVS, environmental health and safety. My fourth hat is about support services. Did I mention support services already? I'm sorry, health equity. Health equity is really what we're talking about right now. And then my 5th hat really focuses on ancillary care. So that's everything from rehab, radiology, and just the general diagnostic services. The reason why I'm telling you those hats is, with health equity, you can't think about health equity in a myopic lens. So how is my perspective on management changed, or really when we think about disparities, how does that influence my management? So when I came into my role, there was a period where coming into my job, I've been here, it'll be a year next week, so I'm still relatively new. There was a period where a lot of people that were coming to work wanted to know, hey, a lot of things in the community are changing, a lot of things in the country are changing. We're the safety net hospital. What are we doing about it? Like, that was the theme, right? We had patients of a different faith. We had patients from different countries who felt like, I don't feel safe when I leave my house anymore. You guys, I spend just as much time with you as I spend at home. Or the next place I spend as much time is with you. What are you doing about it? And for me, I started to ask the question, so how can we respond to our workforce how can we respond to our patients? And then the second thing, the third piece was, how are we talking the talk and walking the walk? So in coming into my role, I realized a theme. A lot of people did not know the difference between equality and health equity. And then the second thing was, how do we even figure out what our baseline is? So I want you to keep our workforce in mind, our patient population in mind, and how do we figure out what equity is? So if you take a look at this graph, the first bar on the left is our UC faculty. These are all the physicians that work at DSMG. The second bar is all the staff that work at DSMG. And if you notice, we stratified all 5 bars by race: white, Asian, Black, and Latino. And then the third bar are all our patients. Okay, so at DSMG, we said our #1 quality metric is readmissions. So being discharged from the hospital and being readmitted within 30 days. At some point, a lot of people felt like we were about to hit our goal, which was less than 15% or less. And then we looked at all-cause readmissions. This is what we were at the time. And then we tried to figure out what is the #1 diagnosis driving readmissions, and it turned out to be heart failure. So when you stratify all of these things that interact with each other by race, what do you notice?
Those last are part
Yeah.
of this.
Yeah?
The largest population that has readmissions is supported by the least from the faculty and staffing.
Yeah. So the question, you have to ask yourself is, what does success mean? If we are about to hit our target, is it success if it doesn't apply to every single? Is it success if it doesn't apply to all? That's the first question, right? When we think about patient access, right? A lot of people here work in hospitals. The classic patient access metric is third next available appointments, right? TNAA is the most statistically significant metric to measure access. If you stratify, my challenge, like if you're meeting your TNAA in less than 10 days, if you stratify it by race, will everybody be at close to the median? Close to the mean? That's a question. So how has this impacted the way I think about management right now? Is the definition of success is changing. We have to think about all for every time, for
This
every
lens
metric.
of health equity.
Yeah. And then one of the things that we've tried to really start teaching about equity and think about all was, if you work at DSMG and if you have a metric in everyone that works at DSMG, your department should have a #1 metric that you're reporting to our patient performance improvement and patient safety committee. So we try to figure out how much of an equity organization are we? And we looked at all the departments at DSMG. How many of them were actively in any way, shape, or form stratifying their metrics by race, ethnicity, and language? And only 6% were. Only 6% were. We are the #1 level trauma center. We are the safety net hospital, right? Nancy Pelosi comes here anytime anything changes with health reform. 6% were. So this is what we started looking at as our equity journey. So in 2018, our goal is 20% of every department should be stratifying your #1 metric by race. And the goal is not simply to stratify, it's to let it, we will not know what improvements we're making unless we actively measure it. So these are the targets we've given ourselves over the next 5 years. So if you happen to work in any department, no matter what your #1 metric is, we want to see how well is it impacting every patient. Does every single person have the same outcome for what you're defining as success, what you're defining as a positive outcome? Does everyone have the same opportunity? Thinking back about the boxes, what are we doing to make sure everyone has the same view and just not an average of everybody? Okay.
So you talk about an ethnically diverse patient population and how that your workforce doesn't quite align with that. So tell us a little bit more about some of the things that you found effective in changing that paradigm.
I'll say Number one by far is humility. Really, no matter the letters next to your name, you have to really be humble to appreciate everyone's journey, everyone's perspective. There's also the belief that every single person, no matter your journey in life, has a bias. Everyone, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, everyone has a bias. So humility starts with, if everyone has a bias, what are we going to do to acknowledge it and then move past it for ourselves, for our workforce, and our patients? So I'll say humility is number one. The second thing for me personally is, no matter what I do, like I've come to truly embrace the fact that I'm an ambassador. Like there's nothing I can do about it. Like I'm an ambassador. Anytime I walk into a room, anytime I say anything, more often than not, I am likely to represent 13% of the population. Sometimes, and at other times, I'm likely to represent the immigration experience. So when I think about how I can contribute, I've started to think about what can I do to better represent. And this is also not something that everybody wants to do. I take it for myself. Like I have an obligation to show what is possible. And I also think about the idea of standing on shoulders that I spoke about earlier. I have an obligation to show what can be done, what can be fulfilled. And I take those two things very, very seriously. And then there's the idea of talking the talk and walking the walk. Right? If we're saying that we want the best care for all, how do we know that we're getting the best care for all? How are you measuring it? How are you showing it? Or is it just something that's in your mission and vision statement?
So you talked a little bit about race, but we also know that there's a lot of diversity in age.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of talk about how the millennial generation works differently than a more traditionalist generation. What have you found in your experience here at this very diverse organization?
I'll mention humility again because I in my role, there is in no way, shape, or form can I assume that I know everything about engineering. I know everything about radiology. There are people that know more than me. For me, success in my role means that I am supporting my teams to get to where they need to get to improve outcomes. And I go back to humility because I have to accept, acknowledge, and embrace the fact that people in areas know more than I do. So the question becomes, how can I support you to be successful? And then just thinking about this whole idea of a generational divide, across the US, millennials, people born 1980 and above, are less likely to stay in a job for, 3.5, 4 years. So what can we do to keep millennials engaged? This is the generation that's actively coming out of college and in grad school, and they're going to be filling the workforce. How do we keep millennials engaged? How do we try and make sure that they are tied to the mission? It's no longer just about pay, right? It's about how do we make sure you stay engaged? And then how do we respect what the people that came before the millennials built? How do we honor those commitments? And I'll say it comes back to humility. Honoring what people built before this generation, and acknowledging that this generation has a different perspective on what success means, on what loyalty means. Nowadays, we're realizing that there are providers that actively want to be more activistic when they come to work. They want their job to reflect like, okay, so this is what's going on in the community. I'm seeing people nodding their heads, right? There are providers coming into the workforce now. If they see something on the news, when they come to work, they want to know, okay, so how are we going to make sure what we're seeing on the news is not happening where we work? What are we doing about it? And then that comes back to the talk and the talk, the walk and the walk.
So, the ACHE, you talked a little bit about diversity and inclusion. That's a major element of the American College, as well as mentorship. Those two themes that you've already touched on are really things that we're promoting through the college. So I'm going to go back to an earlier thing. I know that you are involved in mentoring others not just professionally but outside. Can you have anything to share about your experiences working in the community and being a mentor? You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. Mentorship to me is a way to give back. I will not be where I am if people did not take the time out of their job, out of their day to be there for me. My junior year of high school, an anonymous donor, and I still do not know his name, paid for my freshman year of college. His name or her name, definitely, yeah, till this day, and I tried for years to figure out who it was, and I have no idea. For some reason, this person out there decided to pay for freshman year of college for me. And through my career, there are people who have chosen to take their time out to support my growth, to help me learn. And the only way I can repay them is to do the same and more for people who are hungry. And I have very, very strong feelings about that. Like I'm a product of that, and I want other people who are hungry, who want who have this fire of I want to make a difference. Just give me the chance, and I want to be there for her. I want to be there for him. I want to be there for them because I'm a product of that. Without those people, I would not be here at all.
I think that's a shared experience amongst many of us in healthcare management, really wanting to make a difference and giving back because of the people who have helped us get to where we are. So that's a great thought. So maybe to wrap up before we go into Q&A, so think about the questions you might want to ask, any kind of theme that Tosan's touched on that you may want to have a conversation with him about. But this last one about some of the key characteristics or attributes you think healthcare leaders of today need to cultivate. You talked about humility, but what other characteristics might there be?
I'll say the first thing, transparency and integrity mean a lot more than any metric you can think of. As a leader, I've come to appreciate that so much. Being transparent and just being full of integrity, meaning what you say, and people believing that, I'll say is a big thing for me. But I in no way, I have not mastered this. I'm learning it, and I want to continue to learn it. I don't know that anyone ever masters it. I'll say listening. Listening is really big. I'm in this world right now of how do we know that we are listening to our workforce? How do we know that we're listening to the community? I'll say for a long time, hospitals were like, our role is to take care of the community, make them better, we look at the needs assessment. But then the community, how do we know what impact we're making in the community outside of community benefit, right? Like, how do we know that we are actively changing our community, with jobs and with contracts? How do we know that we're actively what is our role in making the community healthier? And then if there's things going on in the country, if we choose to not be a part of it, or say like, oh, we're a hospital, so like that's not our role, is that the right thing to do? Like, what role do we play when people do not? Wellness means a vast array of things. If people in our community do not feel well, does that count when they're not in the hospital? Like, what is our role there? And then I'll say another thing that I've really, really come to appreciate is resilience. Everyone that works in healthcare in this room, we never know what we're going to expect. I mean, I was reading 340B today. The whole things are changing all the time, and the reality is we still have to see patients. We still have to put patients first. We have to be ready to continue to do what we do and be great at it, regardless of whatever changes around us. So I'll say resilience is going to be a very, very big theme of success. How do we continue to make sure patients stay at the center of everything when we don't know how we're going to be funded, when we don't know where funding is going to come from, when we don't know how laws are going to change, when we don't know how communities are changing? How do we still put patients at the center?
So a lot of things to think about. So we wanted to give an opportunity for, again, extend this conversation to the audience, and we're going to invite questions now. Any of the things that Tosan touched on, career development, on management principles, his bringing his personal experiences into shaping how he approaches the service that he provides through to his staff and to the patients that are receiving those services. So I'm going to open it up for questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just so excited that someone in your position is really trying to bring a message about equality and equity. I have a two-part question, if it's okay. In looking at the data, I wonder how you determined the target goals. So actually, that slide, this one. So just to be able to get the data stratified, like to get to 85% of departments stratified over the next 4 years, it seems like, what with big data these days and being able to analyze, like, what are the major challenges to getting that stratified? And then the second part of the question is for the departments who have been able to stratify, have they seen any successes and any interventions that they might have forward based on the data that they're seeing?
So the first part of the question, and how do we choose the target? I was very ambitious, and in knowing that we started at 6% for 2018, our goal of 20% was, how do we create the infrastructure to get people to want to actually stratify the data? So in actually, even going back to the slide, the way we presented this, and I have a team that works with me on equity, was a lot of times people would see this and feel paralyzed, like, oh my gosh, what do we do? Where are we going to start? And my pushback would be, would you rather not know what your data looks like? Like, would you rather not know how the disparities are impacting your patients? And then after that was, equity should not be additive, right? If we have different people in organizations, we have a HR officer, everyone here that works for a hospital, you have a CFO, you have a chief quality officer. Why is it that when it comes to disparities and equity, we feel like it's additional, right? It's more time. It's more data. People don't feel like trying to understand your budget is additional on top of like that. Is when you hire managers, like there's an expectation to understand your budget. So it was really training. We started training managers to really understand what is real, race, ethnicity, and language, and why is it important to understand these things. We need to know who our population is. So first was training people to understand real. And then the second thing was, before even thinking about interventions, to avoid analysis paralysis, just stratify your data and make sure it's clean. Before even trying to figure out, oh my gosh, we found this out, what are we going to do? Just focus on stratifying in year one. Let's first make sure you have clean data that has data integrity. Let's just start there. And I think that was, I hope it's been successful, but that was a great first step. For us to just say, well, right now, from year one, stratify your data, and then we'll figure it out from there. And then the first part of the question was, how do we choose, how do we come to 85%? In doing this work, we realized that there are some departments that exist that were not reporting anything at all, in the numerator. So, and then the denominator is also going to be changing, right? So as departments expand, as businesses changes, a department one day, like vascular, might one day say, we're trying to expand and start reporting. So we didn't want to automatically make it 100%. We wanted to give ourselves room over time. And then each year was just going to be a different challenge. We're just try and show that we're doing better than we did last year. And then the idea of looking at 5 years, just really saying that equity became, during my tenure, it's become a major strategic priority. So as much as we care about safety, as much as we care about quality care experience, equity is also a major priority for the organization. So if you're coming to work at DSMG, you know that as a leader, these are the 6 things you have to care about. And we do the same thing in orientation, talking about all 6 pillars. Yeah.
How do you address the race disparities between the doctors and the patients, considering the black admission into medical school and the time it takes to train a doctor and all that, and the choice that the doctor have in terms of like where they want to work.
Yeah, that's a very big question, and I appreciate it. So we are. This is also a privilege of working in the Bay Area. It's also a privilege of working at an institute. So at CSMG, all our doctors are UCSF faculty. So Dean Talmadge is African American. He made a commitment and actively trying to recruit more doctors of color into UCSF, like actively coming up with targets, and then actively trying to retain more doctors of color in the Bay Area. Like once they're done with residency, trying to retain them. That is a goal and expectation that the dean of the School of Medicine has actually made for the entire institution, coming down to how we interview and different things like that. So that's on the UCSF side. On the DPH side, two things that I'm trying to respond to this. Like there is the idea of it is not likely to transform the entire workforce of any healthcare institution to reflect the population we serve. It just isn't likely, right? Not that it's impossible, it's not likely. So the question becomes, where are places where we can improve training? Where are places where we can empower our staff and providers to better connect with patients? So those are things we're trying to work on right now. So if there is an area where the workforce does not reflect the patient population at all, we're trying to map out what is the curriculum we're going to bring to this area to better empower the staff. How do we make sure interpreter services are fully functional? How do we make sure that the volume of interpreter services there reflect the demand of the patients that need it in that department? So it is not possible to transform the workforce population in a specific amount of time to reflect the patient population, but we can empower them by providing the training, development, tools, and resources to do so. That takes commitment on multiple levels.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
So what are some of the efforts around cultural competency? I mean, if we can't change the mix, how do we encourage through education the workforce to be more culturally competent? Yeah.
So it is a big commitment. I will not even underestimate that. So at DSMGs, for example, we have a 4-day training for every leader at DSMG focused on cultural humility. 4 full days. 4 full days. If you are a director, a manager at DSMG, you need to take 4 full days. It's usually in a month. You have 1 day each week, and it's one of the days is literally about understanding the 3 types of racism: institutional racism, personally mediated racism, internalized racism. That is a whole day. There's no slides. People sitting around in a circle, and you try to understand that. Then there's another day that's really about understanding empathy. Why is it necessary to truly empathize with not just your patients, but your coworkers? And it's really empathize, like why people's walks in life are different. So this training is called racial humility. Then we have another training that's called trauma-informed systems of care. That's really understanding that the patients we see, it is very easy to say like, oh my gosh, why does this same person keep coming by? Yeah, we know who this person is. You're a high utilizer. But what drives them to come here all the time? Then there's, and then there's the orientation. There's a piece actually that's focused on relationship-centered communication, where really how do we improve how providers communicate with patients and talk about all the different types of bias, especially implicit bias, right? Coming up with tests, and all those different things. So we have like 4 types of trainings that we've been spreading across the campus right now. And I don't know that any organization has perfected this, but it's about starting somewhere.
I know a lot of organizations are starting on the same journey, and so this is why we offer these kinds of programs, is to learn from each other and to share best practices, and because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to serve our patients and our staff and the community better. That's why we're here. So there was a question on this side. Yes.
I was going to say, to work on equity, sometimes you got to consider resources. Like in your analogy, maybe there's not enough boxes to go around, right? So can you kind of give an example of like where it's just really not enough resources to prioritize what you want to do, and how you thought through that?
I'd say it comes back to this triangle right here. You have to make a business case for equity, right? At DSMG, over 70% of the patients we see are patients of color, right? So if 70% of our patients are patients of color, what is our excuse to not prioritize equity? I mean, it's just that. It's that clear. So if this is the population we serve, I mean, a part of my role for the past year was, hey, this is the population we serve. We need to step our game up. So the question doesn't become like, how do you find resources for equity? Is why are there not resources for equity, right? Especially when you understand what your patient population looks like, right? If we can really, really invest resources in equipment, why would we not invest resources in tools to help our staff and providers better support patients? The literature shows over and over and over again that if the relationship between a patient and a provider is key. It's even more powerful if the patient can relate to the provider, be it on language, be it on background. So why would we not invest in that? So you're absolutely right. The resources are tough when it comes to something that can be called soft skills, like equity. So one of the things that I've been trying to, well, I shouldn't say we've been trying to do is really highlight this work. All right? Is this success? I can think of a lot of hospitals in here. I know you're thinking about readmissions, right? Readmissions is a key thing of what keeps you up at night. So why would you not stratify? Stratifying your readmissions data is going to tell you how to better get patients to the right care, right place, right time, right? If you truly get to understand your population and you truly start really understanding the social determinants of health that are aligned with the demographics of the population, the cultural characteristics are aligned with the population, you can improve this metric. If you choose to not stratify and you're only focusing on the numerator and denominator without stratifying, it's not really success. So more than anything, equity shouldn't be additive. It can actually help you get to your target better. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I would just observe that I understand the power of this, and I've fully supportive of it. I think that in some of our communities in the Bay Area, outside of this population here, race and ethnicity might not be the stratification variables, socioeconomic status might be.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to offer that up.
Absolutely.
I understand the context of your population.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
but I think that might be, when I think about some of our more suburban locations, ethnicity may not be the variable, but socioeconomics would be.
Yeah. And I would say that even thinking about that too, that is a part of the stratification. So right now, one of the things we're doing is, as much as we've been focusing on real in the past year, we're now going to be focusing on SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity. And then what my I don't want to say dream, but the plan is at some point we want to start thinking about socioeconomics, right? Because so as a safety net hospital, for you to be able to see here, you have to fit into a specific category, right? 130% of the poverty level qualifying for Medi-Cal, qualifying for different things. So, in safety nets, we know, you fit into this category. But then if you're in a catchment area where payer mix is a larger driving factor, this is where zip codes, come in, right? And then this is where socioeconomic status comes in. But the reason why I wouldn't disqualify real is because language is also a telling factor, for socioeconomics. So I would say that you're absolutely correct. Socioeconomics comes in, and then language can also be, and it's not about just like non-English speakers. Language is also about literacy, right? So how are we actively thinking about, literacy tells a story. How are we thinking about this population that, might not, identify differently when it comes to race and ethnicity, but with language? That is an intervention. With socioeconomics, that is an intervention. With zip code and seeing what clinics are available, what pharmacies are available, that's an intervention. With stratifying is one of the only ways we can get there.
Every year, the American College of Healthcare Executives holds a convention, and it's in Chicago. We call it Congress. And last year, one of the keynote speakers was a gentleman who was working on health equity and social determinants of health. And one of the remarkable things that he showed was a similar graph, by zip code. So we're talking about Chicago, and he took 2 zip codes of Chicago, and the racial mix was pretty much the same, but the morbidity was so vastly different by that zip code. And what was the real determinant was it was a bridge that cut off that zip code from the other zip code, and then it became an economic driver. So zip code is a very large, well, it's a variable that a lot of people are looking at as a way to understand who are we serving and what do we need, what kind of interventions might need to take place. So are there other questions? Because we have time. Yes, Audrey.
Yes. So earlier you made a comment about the importance of when determining the next opportunity, considering one of the steepest learning curve, right? So what would be your advice, assuming that someone is approaching an opportunity, it's not already been given to them? How should they best sell them if they're ready for that challenge to the employer?
I would say, what is the person's story? You know, what have they done to show that they're actively trying to take on more? What is their driver? And a lot of things, you know, I would say that, you know, your story, not just your resume, your story says a lot about what you are trying to achieve. And then I believe that as a leader, we should always give an opportunity to people who are hungry. I'm also a very big believer that it's not always just about the school you went to. It's not always just about, you know, the mix of the letters next to your name. But when someone is really, really hungry and they might not have the decade or 7 years in experience, in the experience that they have, what have they shown? Really, really highlighting the work that this person has done to show that they're willing to take on more and take on more, and then what have the results been? That is the story. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Thank you for your presentation tonight, Tosan. Tell us about navigating the political side of San Francisco and how that differ with San Mateo County, where I'm from.
Okay. Well,
and I work in San Francisco County. So
okay. Well,
city and county.
I happen to work for San Mateo County. It is it is very different. It is very different. I will make a political statement. I will say that it is very important to understand the politics when you work for a city organization. I know people here who worked in my previous organization. Politics are very different in San Mateo County. This is not a secret. I've had 3 mayors in the past 3 months. You know, I mean, my boss's boss's boss is the mayor of the same county of San Francisco. And it's really, really important to just, this goes back to why I said resilience is key, right? What is your mission? How are you trying to achieve it? And ask yourself, how are you going to continue to put the patient at the center? And you want to really focus on that, because ultimately politics, no matter how chaotic it can get, should not impact what you're doing. So I would say that you have to be aware of it. You have to really, really, really pay attention. And then you also just bring it back to the patient. And that is my philosophy. I don't know if this is a great answer. Bring it back to the patient every single time. Every single time. And the best thing for the patient should not be politicized. That's one of the biggest things I've struggled, you know, with the Affordable Care Act. You know, putting the patient at the center should not be politicized. We have to figure out what is the best thing to do to make sure that patients who are uninsured or at risk of being uninsured get the best care possible. And I would say that no matter where you're working, if you're continue to put the patient at the center, and no matter who you're actively trying to advocate with that supports the funding for where you are, just put that a priority of every conversation. And say, hey, listen, this is where we are, this is where the 1115 waiver is, or these are the capital needs that we have on campus, this is why it's going to support the patient, and just being very consistent about that. Because if the more consistent you are, the less likely they are to believe that you have some type of agenda that is outside of that. I don't know I mean, I don't know how effective that is going to be for you, but that has been my grounding. And
I work in corporate healthcare. You have to be adaptation.
Yeah.
Focused, otherwise, it's the same thing in the
Yeah.
city and county. So I appreciate your conversation about resilience.
Yeah, necessary.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for speaking with us. The purpose of the question I was, as a native born San Francisco that works in the hospital and healthcare, that also formerly worked in San Francisco politics, that current state graph there is not surprising at all. It's exactly what I would expect without stratifying anything. So how do you think you'll be able to quantify maybe equity as a base of your true north metric? How will it attack that particular problem? CAHL readmissions for African American patients. How will it help to maybe deal with the biases that we don't really talk about because they deal with this patient population?
So I'll try and answer from two ways. The first way I'd say is I've come to believe that if you design a system for the most disenfranchised population, everyone benefits. So when, I feel like, we're in this world where sometimes people are like, so why, if you're noticing disparity, sometimes people might be like, well, we treat everyone the same. Why do we need to treat this person different? Or why do we need to treat this population different? And now my thing is, would you rather not do something different? Would you rather this continue to exist? Are you okay with that? And then my second thing is, if we better design the system for the most disenfranchised population, everybody benefits. When right now we're trying to do a whole strategy around SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and then we have people from across the entire arena of healthcare, from race, ethnicity, language. It's like, why do I need to start caring about pronouns? Why not? What's so additive about that? Why should I start caring about the sexual orientation of our patients? Why not? Don't you want to know? As the city and county of San Francisco, we were on the front lines of the HIV epidemic. Do we not want to make sure that our LGBT community population gets just as good care as every single other patient? Why would we choose to not want to know that? And then once you make, from my perspective, once you start prioritizing equity and letting people know that we want to talk the talk and walk the walk, and you start having a burning platform like this, for me, this was how I say, so are we really the best? Right? If we transform that gray line, which patient is not going to benefit from it? So if you think about doing this work, right? If we start thinking about this population, if somebody just throws up there, oh yeah, those are the homeless populations, and if we decide to make sure that every person who is struggling with housing has a care package, has groceries when they go home, regardless of what they look like, why is that not going to be great, right? If we try and start, coming up with interventions for language or sending a nurse out, if this teaches us, hey, you know what? If you have a nurse come out to the house within 3 days from their discharge, and we did that for everybody, how are they not going to benefit? So for me, equity is right now really about this is what we're learning from the most disenfranchised population. Let's test something. Let's try something. What do we lose? And at the point, I need people to start telling me I don't care. And then that says something. And if you don't care, then maybe this is not the right place for you. And I'll say one thing. I feel like we're in a time in healthcare now where we cannot continue to give people the easy out. This is where I'm speaking as to some, the idea of feeling bad about bringing up, inequities. No, there's this whole oh, I don't want to bring this up right now because I don't know how they're going to feel. Think about who is being impacted by not bringing up this conversation. That's thousands of people, right? We've reached a point where we can't just continue to be comfortable to not say anything. Every time we choose to not have a hard conversation, this continues to happen, right? So as a native of San Francisco, aware of everything that's going on in the city, this is where we start saying, hey, things going on in the city aren't just happening in one place. it's not just housing. Housing is just one factor. There's a whole bunch of other things, and highlighting that all the time.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you kind of just touched upon it, but earlier you mentioned outside forces that affect your patients that beyond your four walls that you have no control of. So curious with your organization, how do you guys kind of reach out to kind of prevent even some readmission that may be caused by those outside forces?
Yeah.
That you guys can either partner with other organizations or how to kind of be more, I would say more preventative, I guess.
Yeah. I'd say that's one of the benefits of working for a public agency, like similar to San Mateo County. DSMG is part of the San Francisco Department of Public Health, and under the San Francisco Department of Public Health, we have epidemiology, we have community health education, we have outreach, and then as working for the city, we're also partnered with food insecurity groups, Medi-Cal. So I think, and this was one of the dreams of the Affordable Care Act, right? The idea of the more we insure people, the more we become value-based care. We need to start thinking about who else is out there that's not just thinking about the hospital that can keep our patients out. So I was like, I would encourage you as you come out of school and start thinking about what organization you want to work for. Integration means something different. And when you think about vertical integration, it's no longer just about this is a clinic, this is the ancillary services, this is the acute care tower. Nowadays, it's about this is not just a clinic, but this is a pharmacy and a community that they're working with, right? These are the community-based organizations that actually send referrals to this place. These are the wellness centers in these areas. I would encourage you to think about integration meaning something different nowadays, and thinking about organizations that are actively invested in the community, because nowadays hospitals cannot solve problems by themselves anymore, and I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of that. And that's the other beauty of health information exchange, and with EHRs, data is going to be key in the future. I don't know that it's going to solve everything, but when we start thinking about what risk, and you're going to realize this when you come out of school, like there's a whole idea of risk stratification, and what does risk mean? If you fit a certain demographic, and your quality measures fit this, this measure right here, like your risk of more morbidities is different. So you're not like what is within the community, what is within the zip code, like we mentioned earlier. And I would encourage you to think about those types of organizations when you come out. I'm happy to recommend that.
So any final words before we conclude and join in for some more networking?
Yeah, thank you for coming out in the cold. Come on here. Thank you for staying awake. I didn't see one person dozing. Really, really appreciate it. I hope if there's one thing you take from this conversation, healthcare is more than a team sport. Please have these conversations about equity. And ultimately, equity really is about putting the patients at the center and actively getting to know them, not just in the time you interact with them. But those conversations for you might see 15, 20 patients in a day. That person sees you that day. And that one moment counts more to the patient, and it probably does to you. So just really, really think about that. And I talked about resilience because healthcare, a lot, it's very easy to feel like, oh, we're always in a moment of crisis over the past couple of years, but healthcare, if you take a step back, has always been in crisis, right? The storms are just harder in some moments than others, but we just have to be more resilient. And the reality is, actually, healthcare is in my perspective, a better place today than it was before, especially for safety net hospitals. And we live in the Bay Area. We live in a region that's not perfect in any way, shape, or form. I see you. But, we have progressive policies out here. So how do we leverage that? We live in a place where people care about recycling. We live in a place where people have, cameras on law enforcement. We live in a place where people are willing to invest in communities. So how do we leverage that? I have colleagues in the South who the idea of doing this work is so foreign. I'll share one story. One of the colleagues who is doing equity work is in Greensboro, North Carolina. I've been working with him for the past year on how they can stand up an equity council similar to what we're doing out here. The hospital in North Carolina was originally a segregated hospital. He was not allowed to be born in that hospital in the 50s. The only reason the hospital desegregated was because the federal government refused to give them federal dollars unless they desegregated. They just recently got a new CEO. And the new CEO said he wanted to do an apology to the community to really acknowledge the challenges in that community and do something different. And the CEO apologized, it was in the news, it was great, it was really popular. But when my colleague tried to present in front of the medical faculty to do some type of cultural humility training, after all of this, he was outvoted. They felt they didn't need to do any cultural humility training. This is the South, right? So as much as we might have challenges in the Bay Area, you know, our colleagues out there in different parts of the country are trying to get to where we are. So when I think about that, we have an obligation, you know, when we live in a place where policies, more often than not, are, if you're coming here tonight, chances are you believe in some of the progressive policies and trying to put patients first. We have an obligation to show what can be done and show the business case of it and make sure it's not additive. So I'd encourage you to just think about that.
So let's thank Tosan for his remarks tonight.
Healthcare is undergoing incredible transformation, and so are the career opportunities for healthcare leaders. ACHE is committed to providing meaningful new solutions to help healthcare leaders adapt their skills and plot a course for career success. We are pleased to bring you Career Edge, a unique and interactive tool that will help you define your career goals and identify the skills, knowledge, and experience needed to reach those goals and maintain satisfaction in your career. This is a complimentary benefit available only to ACHE members. As soon as you sign into Career Edge, you'll find a personalized online career dashboard with career planning tools, job site links, news items, and other valuable resources, including access to several free assessments. But there's so much more. Use the Career Edge framework to build a solid career plan based on in-depth information about yourself and the healthcare marketplace. From there, you can develop an action plan addressing your needs at both a personal and professional level. You'll also have the option to share assessment results, career analysis, and action plans with a coach or mentor. This easy-to-navigate one-stop source contains a full array of resources needed for a strategic approach to career management at any career level. We are excited to launch this new tool and invite you to explore Career Edge today.